Okay, the next item of business is a debate on motion 16844 in the name of Mark Griffin on children's rights and temporary accommodation. I'd invite members wishing to participate in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. I call on Mark Griffin to speak to and move the motion. Up to 7 minutes. Mr Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move the motion in my name. If you're a mum or a dad, or actually whether you've got any kids at all, Shelter's publication on the stories of children in temporary accommodation is stark, a real hard, difficult read. You can't help but imagine your own children or kids of other families, perhaps that you spoil, comfort, laugh or play with, faced with some of the intolerable conditions and situations described within it. Towards the end of that report, there's a story a mum tells about a little boy who's 6. She says at Christmas and on his birthdays, people ask him what he would like to put on his list for Santa or what he would like as a birthday present. And he has to say nothing, because his mum knows and he knows that the next time they have to move house, the next time they'll be forced to move to the next set of temporary accommodation, she'll have to leave his toys behind as well. Now, the feelings of isolation and unsettlement permeate absolutely every line of Shelter's report. And we're told that unsuitable accommodation orders are in place to stop children living in hostels or B&Bs for more than 7 days. But what's happening is that councils are having to move families from one to another every 7 days just so they don't breach the order. The number of children living in these places increased by more than 200% last year. Now, can you imagine being 6 and packing up your whole world every single week? What is it that you leave behind? What is it that you can't manage to fit in your bag that week? What is it of yourself that you're leaving behind every week? And then where do you move to? What does unsuitable really mean? Because there's a mum who says that her home is wet and very, very cold. She says that both her boys have asthma and they're both in and out of hospital all winter. There's another who describes her child throwing up blood and in hospital for 6 weeks because the temporary accommodation they live in isn't clean. In unsuitable accommodation, a child is having to use a bedroom sink to brush her teeth because the area around the toilet she's supposed to use is covered in absolute filth. Kids describe rats, bugs, mould, and every single time, again and again, the cold. They're learning resilience out of necessity, but they're lonely, insecure, cold and sad. Some of them act out at school, taking their feelings out on others, understandable, but again, disrupting their own education. Now, I can't begin to imagine what it's like to be a parent, trying your best, trying to make things okay, but every single day, seeing your child getting sadder and sadder right in front of you because of what your home is doing to them. And there's a feeling throughout this report of children and their parents being forgotten about that will absolutely stay with me forever, that these families and more than 10,000 other children have somehow disappeared into dirty, damp places that suck their childhood away. And I just can't accept, I can't believe that that's acceptable in Scotland in 2025. We're nearly a year into this government reluctantly declaring a housing emergency, the same government that promised to reduce the number of children in temporary accommodation long ago. And we're still reading about kids witnessing stabbings, not able to sleep at night, feeling scared and alone. And when asked about this report at topical questions, the government, as they often do, talked about empty homes, cutting voids, acquisitions and working groups. But it takes a fair amount of front to respond to the reports in this publication. Children watching someone else being stabbed, responding to that with plans for working groups. And Willie Rennie at the question session the other week, I think he voiced the Chamber's absolute disbelief. I think he asked the Minister if he'd actually read the report, because any sense of empathy, urgency in the face of that absolutely bleak reality of what is described in that report seems absolutely absent. Now, I accept that local authority housing departments are having to take impossible decisions. You know, I don't believe that a single one of those housing officers would ever willingly place a child in a house that they know will cause them harm. I don't envy them in their jobs just now. I don't really know how they turn up for work. But it's because of this government's complete failure to tackle the shortage of supply of homes in Scotland, because of the government's abject failure to take urgent action on the housing emergency. These are the choices that we're asking housing officers to make. We've got a housing bill progressing through Parliament, but it hardly addresses the issues of the housing emergency that are ravaging a generation of Scotland's children. It doesn't build any new homes for them. It doesn't stop them waking up in cold, unsafe, unhealthy rooms. They want to see something different. They want to see it now. And so I've tried in some of my amendments to the housing bill to get to the heart of that issue. Because when the Scottish Government failed to bring down the number of children in temporary accommodation as a matter of urgency, then I think it breaches those children's rights. And if passed, those amendments will require relevant bodies to take account of children's rights in deciding where their homes should be. Because it's blatantly obvious to me that a system that places children in these situations is not putting their best interests at the heart of decision-making. If they did, that would be impossible, that no child in the 21st century in Scotland would be in hospital because of where they live and what that was doing for them. So, Presiding Officer, I'm asking the Government, I'm actually begging the Government on behalf of the children, the families and the parents in this report, and the thousands of others who haven't been able to be quoted, who are in temporary accommodation, to replace that lethargy with absolute urgency. What's in this report should never have happened, and I'm asking this chamber to collectively agree and pledge that this is the last generation of children that has to face this.
Thank you, Mr Griffin. I now call on Paul McLennan to speak to and move Amendment 16844.3. Minister, around 5 minutes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Presiding Officer, and formally move the amendment in my name. I welcome this afternoon's debate on housing, which follows a few weeks after the Shelter Scotland published a research on children living in temporary accommodation. I attended and spoke at that event. This report laid bare some of the stark conditions that Mark Griffin had mentioned and for children and their families' experience of living in temporary accommodations, which, quite frankly, is unacceptable, and I'll agree with him on that point. It's important to remember, however, that not all temporary accommodation is unsuitable accommodation. However, we know lengthy stays in temporary accommodation are not good for the health and well-being of families. That is why our housing emergency response is focused on, I'll just skip further into the speech if that's all right and come back to that. That's why our housing emergency response is focused on working with local authorities and partners to increase the supply of social and affordable homes, particularly larger family homes. And in doing so, households will be able to move into settled home more quickly, reducing the uncertainty and instability of temporary accommodation.
Martin Whitfield, briefly.
I'm very grateful to the Minister to take the intervention. Is the Scottish Government saying that temporary accommodation complies with the UNCRC rules on the human rights of children?
Minister.
I'll come on to that later on in my speech, if that's okay, Mr Whitfield. So just in terms of continue, you also know that the harm can be caused by the condition of some temporary accommodation payments. The Scottish Government is clear that the provision of temporary accommodation should consistently be of a high standard, and that households living there should receive good quality services that meets their needs. That's why in 2023 the Scottish Government published a temporary accommodation standards framework. The framework sets out physical, location, service management standards to ensure the temporary accommodation is of good quality and is safe and is affordable. That's something obviously we'll need to discuss with COSLA and other stakeholders. All local authorities should ensure that temporary accommodation they provide to accommodate households meets this framework. A public consultation is required before the framework can be implemented, and I'm pleased to say today that we'll be beginning that consultation later this year. Now, on local authorities, the Government is focused on driving down the number of households, especially those with children living in temporary accommodation. Our latest statistics show that 12 authorities reduced the number of households in temporary accommodation in 23-24. In 20 Local authorities have reduced the number of children in temporary accommodation. And we're talking about actions that have been taken. We've also mentioned about the voids that Mark Griffin had mentioned. And we've seen, for example, a 40% reduction in Edinburgh, 23% reduction in Fife, 25% reduction in West Lothian and 20% reduction in South Lanarkshire. So that action that we're taking just now is making a difference in bringing homes more quickly. And for example, there's been a 33% reduction of the number of children living in temporary accommodation between September 23 and 24 in my own constituency. However, we know that housing and homelessness pressures are not uniform across Scotland. In response to this, we've provided funding of £80 million over this year and next, 80% of which have been targeted to 5 local authorities which have the most sustained temporary accommodation pressures. To date, this has supported local authorities to bring 1,000 homes back into use through acquisitions and reduce the number of empty homes. So that's that action that we're taking, and we're seeing outcomes of this coming through. On the housing bill, Mark Griffin obviously has put amendments forward at stage 2, and I'll be happy to engage with him tomorrow at committee and beyond that, and we've discussed that in terms of that. So I think every child deserves a safe and warm place to go home. It's a fundamental human right. On the UNCRC point that Mr Whitfield mentioned, the UNCRC, which I know he follows very, very closely, it means that public authorities have a legal duty under Section 6 of the Act, not just to act, or fail to act in a way that is incompatible with the UNCRC requirements in the Act when carrying out certain functions. So that's something that's really important in terms of that. And I know that's where Mark Griffin's amendment has obviously come through. And again, willing to discuss that with yourself, Mr Whitfield, going forward. Along with other UNCRC requirements, these requirements also include that the best interest of a child should be a primary consideration in all actions concerning children. On AWAB's law, the tragic death of AWAB Ishak in Rochdale in 2020 has highlighted the issue of damp and mould in housing. The quality of housing has improved over a number of years due to the actions of this government. We know that most social landlords in Scotland do keep their properties in a good state of repair and tackle issues promptly. The Scottish House Condition Survey shows that over 90% of homes have no damp or condensation. However, we know that damp and mould still occurs, and that waiting for repairs brings physical and mental health risks. I think anybody wants tenants in Scotland to live in these conditions. That's why I was very pleased to be bringing forward an amendment to the Housing Bill, which, similar to AWAB's law in England, and we've been working with the government in England, will require social landlords to investigate and address issues in a timely manner, especially when they affect tenants' health. We are committed to implementing AWAB's law for private tenants after engagement with the private rented sector, and that's an issue I've raised with them on a number of occasions. If I've got time? No, I'll try and bring that up in closing, Mr Simpson. We already have a strong set of rights and standards that have been improving the conditions of homes in Scotland. However, these measures will go even further and give power and confidence to tenants that their health will be protected. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, hearing of the conditions of some children are experiencing in temporary accommodation has only reinforced this Government's commitment to improve the life chances of children in Scotland. We are taking all possible actions to help deliver more high-quality, permanent homes, provide the right homes in the right places and ensure a settled home for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Yes, simply a reminder to the Chamber that we are very tight for time in these debates, and the same is true today. And I call on Megan Gallagher to speak to and move Amendment 16844.2 up to 4 minutes. Ms Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. Well, it's been 10 months since the Scottish Government were forced into declaring a housing emergency. Local councils, of course, followed suit, referencing the growing numbers of people declaring themselves as homeless and having to place families in temporary accommodation as they do not have the supply to meet demand. But at the same time, measures such as the introduction of rent controls have led to £3.2 billion of lost investment, with a significant drop in house building. Something has gone dreadfully wrong, and I have no confidence that this government will be able to produce a plan that will tackle the housing emergency before the end of this parliamentary term. Scottish Labour have rightly focused their debate today on the impacts of temporary accommodation and the impact that that will have on children and young people. I don't have time, I've got 4 minutes today. 10,300, that number should shame the Scottish Government into action. And action is exactly what this Government promised to deliver following 15 recommendations from the Temporary Accommodation Task and Finish Group back in 2023. I believe that the Government said at that time, we will prioritise action that will have the greatest impact to reduce the number of households in temporary accommodation by 2026. And that's what this Government promised. Yet here we are. and the numbers of people in temporary accommodation is rising exponentially. And to add insult to injury to the government, the publication of, in their own words, experiences in temporary accommodation lays bare the scale of the problems. Now, I accept that there is a pilot programme being rolled out to 5 local authorities with the most sustained temporary accommodation pressures to increase supply through buying back properties and bringing long-term empty homes back into use. However, in a written question I submitted in relation to what immediate steps is being taken to guarantee that all temporary accommodation needs make the basic standards of safety, cleanliness and suitability for all households with children. The Minister responded advising that the Scottish Government published a standards framework in 2023. Although they will need to further consult if the framework can be legally enforced. This was published back in 2023, so if the Minister does have time in his concluding remarks, can he answer the question, what exactly has been done? Presiding Officer, it would be remiss of me if I did not mention the Housing Bill, which is, of course, the Scottish Government's biggest missed opportunity to tackle the housing emergency. This legislation should be about housing, yet it will not build one single home. I will leave the issues I have with rent controls just to one side for today. However, I will gently remind the Minister that should billions of investment continue to be lost, this will be on his watch. However, that being said, I did welcome the amendment submitted by the Minister to be included in the Housing Bill regarding the introduction of Awab's Law, something, of course, that I called for in the Chamber last week. However, this shows that many issues that could have been included within the Housing Bill have not been included within the Housing Bill. And I'm still unclear, actually, in terms of the amendment the Minister has submitted and why this doesn't include the private rented sector, because that's, of course, what it includes down in Westminster, so why not here? So perhaps he can also expand on that in his closing speech, as he was only too happy, of course, to tell me that most of the mould and damp instances occur in the private rented sector, despite the issue I raised directly with him related to a social landlord. Presiding Officer, I am out of time, but to conclude, the only way out of the housing emergency is to build more homes. But until this government gets a grip on the housing situation we face in Scotland, my fear is that more children will be stranded in temporary accommodation, which will not allow them to go on and live full lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Gallagher. I now call Maggie Chapman again, up to 4 minutes. Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm deeply grateful to Shelter Scotland and the authors of this clear, comprehensive, yet heartbreaking report. Just reading it is a harrowing experience. To write it, to listen to those stories must have been much more so. And of course, to live those stories, to experience those horrors, and then to retell them for the benefit of others. That is worthy of the greatest respect and gratitude. So thank you, most of all, to the children and families who shared their stories with such grace, such insight, and such integrity. I don't use the word horrors lightly. There are some terrible accounts in this report, all the more chilling for the matter-of-fact way that they are told. Thick black mould, not just on bedroom walls, but on a child's bed itself. Carpet soaked with urine and shared bathrooms smeared with faeces. Heating that doesn't work in the depths of a Scottish winter. A child in hospital from an infection caused by rat infestation. Another who lost 2.5 stone as a result of their surroundings. Exposure to violence, including stabbings and shooting. And noise through the night, so loud that a child repeatedly fell asleep in their own classroom. Those are the stories that shock us, but there are many more, not so dramatic perhaps, but just as haunting. The daily struggles to make a home, the quiet spirals of loss, anxiety, and stigma. We read of unsafe accommodation without basic protections like properly installed fire alarms, functional lighting, window guards, or safety gates. We read of unsafe surroundings, of violence, knives and needles, confrontational neighbours, and nowhere safe to play. We read of unhealthy accommodation, often cold and damp, with lack of space and facilities leading to sleep deprivation, malnutrition, delays in development and long-term, lifetime trauma. The mental health impacts for children and their parents are often worse than the physical, with worry and anger, shame and secrecy, isolation and a sense of hopelessness. Some of those will stay with children for the rest of their lives. Some of those will make those lives shorter than they would otherwise be. Every age group suffers, babies and toddlers without space to learn to crawl and walk, their shouts and cries quickly shushed for fear of the neighbours. School children separated from family and friends with long journeys to school, missing opportunities, losing concentration, recognising and sharing their parents' sadness. Teenagers without privacy or a place to study, ashamed of where they live, losing self-esteem, susceptible to risky behaviour and lifelong consequences. The costs in every sense are far too high. For families charged rent they cannot afford, with debt in Scotland for temporary accommodation standing at over £33 million. For essential furniture and appliances which should have been supplied, for storage fees and taxi fares and the cost of running small electric heaters when the radiators don't work, again, for another week. For lost childhoods and chances, for lost agency and control, for lost toys, the swing in the old garden, never forgotten. But it doesn't have to be like this. We can change this. Children's rights can be realised. They must be realised as a matter of moral as well as legal responsibility. This report's recommendations show us the way forward. There are challenges that can and must be made now. Changes to provision, to services, to strategies, changes to legislation and policy, changes in attitude and priority. In closing, I will say more about those later on, about my commitment, shared with my Green colleagues, to make home a safe, secure and permanent place, a reality for children everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Willie Rennie again, up to 4 minutes. Mr Rennie.
What's really interesting, the government's amending the Labour motion today, but it's doing an add-on amendment. And in effect, it's accepting that there has been a breach of the UNCRC. Now, that is quite a moment for the government to accept so readily that it's not just one breach, but numerous breaches, we assume. But yet there's no, I would expect, urgent action on the back of that. The Minister's just repeating what he's already doing. But it's quite an admission for the government to acknowledge that the United Nations, the International Rights Convention for Children, has been breached on numerous occasions. So I would hope in the Minister's summing up that we might get something a little bit more urgent with his response, because we've heard today the real consequences. And this report, I think, reveals that this is not all just about numbers. This is about human lives, the impact on their security, on their mental health, their schools, their education, transport. Their life is in limbo. And it's not just one, it's numerous. Thousands of children are in limbo. And the one quote that I think struck me most, because it's nothing you can really, it's probably just as much mental as it is actual physical. I'm coming back to a home that no matter how much I clean, it feels dirty. You can't get that out of your head. That must be there 24/7, never escapes you. So I hope the Minister does respond in a much more significant way than he has so far. The standards framework that the Minister's talked about, and Megan Gallagher is right, 2 years ago, we're still at the starting line, but we don't even know what the baseline is. And I've asked the Minister this before, and he was unable to give me an answer. The government's not even asked whether we're anywhere near meeting this standards framework. Are we? Do we understand what's really going on with landlords, social landlords, private landlords across the country, with temporary accommodation? Do we understand that? It doesn't seem to be the case that the Minister's in a hurry to try and understand, because it was 2 years ago that this framework was started. Now, we shouldn't forget that half of the children in temporary accommodation in Glasgow are refugee families. It's not been a part of the debate so far, and they have to live life in that limbo for a very, very long time. And it should be something that we need to consider ourselves about how we respond to the treatment of refugees that they have to repeatedly, and I've witnessed it myself, they have to live in hotels or other type of accommodation for very long periods of time. But at the root of the problem here is the lack of investment. And actually, I want to disagree with Megan Gallagher on one point. She says that this bill is not driving any kind of investment. I actually think it probably is, and government policy is, simply by removing many of the damaging policies that the government had introduced in previous years. It is neutered. It is considering bringing in exemptions out build to rent, and also in terms of mid-market rent, which weren't there before. So the only thing that's actually making progress is the removal of the barriers that the government had put in place in the first place. So I think that, to some degree, I'm trying to be generous here, to some degree that it is progress. I am hunting for some credit to give to the Minister. But we do need to take the opportunity in the Housing Bill to make sure that those amendments do actually incentivise investment in housing, because we have seen significant detriment in recent years. 12% decrease in starts for housing in all sectors, 10% decrease in completions. That's a terrible record, and we need to fix it.
Thank you, Mr. Rennie. We now move to the open debate, and I call first Faisal Chowdhury to be followed by Marie McNair. Up to 4 minutes, Mr. Chowdhury.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The report from Shelter Scotland is uncomfortable and depressing reading, but unfortunately for many members will be unsurprising, merely confirming what we have already heard from our constituents. It is an indictment of an SNP government which allowed the housing emergency to grow and grow. This is especially true in Edinburgh, which has the highest number of children waiting for temporary accommodation of anywhere in Scotland. Its findings are stark and show children being failed and their rights not being met. Last year, North Edinburgh Parents Action Group published a similar report to Shelter. Both find common issues faced by people in temporary accommodation, particularly mould and damp. The Shelter report states dampness, mould and inadequate maintenance are observable and pervasive features in children's lives. Damp and mould were described as causing discomfort and fear in children, and frustration and stress in parents, who not only faced great concern for their children's health, but could not get these issues fixed for months. This does not meet a child's right to an adequate standard of living or best health. Crime and antisocial behaviour also featured in the experience of children and parents. One family with 4-year-old mentioned neighbours consistently shouting and threatening to kill each other at night. Many parents restricted outdoor play due to crime and drug taking. Now, these issues alone are harmful to children's development and health. But we must stress the compounding nature of these experiences. Research shows a child who cannot sleep due to antisocial behavior is more likely to do poorly at school. A parent who is stressed and anxious and their life situation may cause a stressed and anxious child. Years spent in temporary accommodation have lifelong consequences. So investing and raising standards, and most importantly, lowering the wait for social housing benefit us all in the long term. The conditions described in this report are appalling and shame us all. They fall far of what vulnerable children need and deserve. Its recommendation should be implemented by the Scottish Government. I've called for AWAB's law to be implemented in Scotland to ensure damp and mould are addressed. So I welcome the Scottish Government coming out in favour of that. Children lose out socially and educationally when they move schools. We should be looking to keep children at the same school unless absolutely necessary. But above all, we need to build more social housing. It is the clearest demand in the report. The current rate of social and private house building does not touch the sides and must be accelerated. As we are approach 1 year since declaring a housing emergency, this report serves as a painful reminder that a failure to act is failing Scotland children. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Marie McNair to be followed by Graham Simpson. Up to 4 minutes, Ms McNair.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The SNP Scottish Government is committed to ensuring every child has the right to grow up in a safe and comfortable home. In the report, Shelter Scotland state, and I quote, "The Scottish Government has taken bold steps to adopt a human rights approach to ending adverse childhood experiences. Their decision to enshrine the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law promised a Scotland where every child has the right to a standard of living that is good enough to meet their physical and social needs and support their development. Presiding Officer, this ensures children's voices are not just heard but listened to. I accept, however, that too many children are living in temporary accommodation. The Scottish Government recognise this, and that is why the SNP is taking the decisive action needed to address the housing emergency, get families out of temporary accommodation and eradicate child poverty in Scotland. And that's why in Scotland we invest more than per person to tackle homelessness and keep people in their homes than any other UK nation. We're delivering a further 110,000 affordable homes by 2032, and we're set to invest £768 million in the Affordable Housing Supply Programme in 25-26, so that everybody in Scotland can have a safe, warm, affordable home that they deserve. And despite dealing with a challenging financial context, Scotland continues to make steady progress in how we tackle homelessness. On temporary accommodation, we are taking action to reduce the use of this, which includes the £83 million National Acquisition Programme over 23-24, which delivered almost 1,500 social and affordable homes. And we will go further with £80 million in acquisitions until 2026, all playing a strong role in ensuring children are kept within secure and safe homes. However, we are all part to play in this, and that includes the UK Government. And I've got to say, Mr Griffin is a really decent guy, and I'm sure, like myself, he's still shell-shocked by the humane attack on disabled people by his party yesterday when they announced the cuts to benefits. And this will have a dreadful impact on the financial security of many and subsequently their housing situation. This is a disgusting decision that penalises those who are most vulnerable. And Anna Sarwar bizarrely claims it's not austerity. Well, if it's not austerity, what is it? Because it clearly is. An independent analysis by Crisis has shown that austerity-driven policies, including the two-child limit, are undoubtedly driving up homelessness right across the country. This contrasts with the SNP committed to ending the two-child policy, and this year will provide around £97 million in discretionary housing payments and mitigate the bedroom tax and the benefit cap. In the face of Westminster austerity, the SNP has delivered an average 7,750 affordable homes each year across Scotland. Prior to this, at a time of plenty, the Labour-led Scottish Executive built just 6 council houses when last in office, and since 2007, over 135,000 affordable and social homes have been completed under SNP governments, proportionally 45% more affordable homes than England and 70% more than in Wales. Presiding Officer, despite the Labour Party promising change, they deliver more of the same, and in contrast, Scotland is the only part of the UK where child poverty is expected to fall, a direct result of the SNP's progressive policies which put children first. And the consequential impact of Labour's cuts on support to disabled people announced yesterday will put much more pressure on the Scottish Government. But it's only the SNP who take the housing emergency seriously, and as part of that, we recognise that that includes the rights of children to have a safe and secure home, and we need to work together on this matter.
Thank you. I now call Graham Simpson to be followed by Martin Whitfield. Up to 4 minutes. Mr Simpson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It's now nearly a year since the Scottish Government accepted what the rest of us already knew and declared a housing emergency. It's been a year of missed opportunities and increasing misery for those who do not have a permanent place to call home. So what a pity that the Cabinet Secretary isn't here today to help out her beleaguered Housing Minister. Government statistics show us... no, you can come back in later, potentially. Government statistics show us that 15,500 children in Scotland became homeless last year. According to Shelter Scotland, 10,360 children are currently in temporary accommodation, an increase of 5% compared to the previous year, and a 150% increase over the past 10 years. These are damning figures. None of us is in the position of living somewhere that you know is only temporary. The Shelter report, in their own words, spells out from the children affected a situation that should make the government sit up. It is little wonder that Alison Watson of Shelter Scotland said, "Their words have put into stark relief the fact that children are bearing the brunt of Scotland's housing emergency. Our children are being denied their rights and condemned to growing up in often poor quality, entirely unsuitable temporary accommodation." She's right. Children spoke of living miles away from friends and of sleeping in beds covered with black mould, placed in accommodation with urine-soaked carpets, dead rats and broken windows, with no access to decent cooking and washing facilities. They spoke of lack of sleep, poor nutrition and hygiene, repeated hospital visits, and all this leading to a great emotional toll for children and their families. It's hard to imagine the uncertainty that such a lifestyle, if you can call it that, brings. Now, in February, we learned that there are more children trapped in temporary accommodation in Edinburgh than in the whole of Wales. That's more than 3,600 as of November 2024, compared with 2,823 children stuck in temporary accommodation across Wales in the same month. Glasgow's in the same position. As of September the 30th, 2024, there were 16,634 households in temporary accommodation in Scotland. But it's not just the overall figures, but the length of time that families are spending there. For cases that closed between April and September last year, where there was at least one temporary accommodation placement, households spent an average of 234 days in temporary accommodation. That's shocking. That compares to 222 for the same six-month period in 2023 and 233 for October 2023 to March 2024. So it's got worse, and the situation is worse in Edinburgh. Now, according to the government's own homelessness update of last September, between April and September last year, there were 7,500 instances of households not being offered temporary accommodation, which is breaking the law. The Minister mentions AWAB's law. I've seen an amendment which may deal with this issue, I'm not really sure, but he mentioned earlier that it would aim to fix problems in a timely manner. I don't know what a timely manner means. Perhaps you can explain what that is. Presiding Officer, we've known about all these problems for years. Very little has changed. The reality of life for some people in Scotland is a badge of shame that should make any housing minister consider their position.
Thank you. I now call Martin Whitfield to be followed by Willie Coffey. Up to 4 minutes, Mr Whitfield.
Deputy Presiding Officer, and it's a pleasure to follow Graham Simpson in this very important debate, because the voices of Scotland's children need to be heard. And in the report, in their own words, Children's Experiences in Temporary Accommodation, commissioned by Shelter Scotland, for which I thank them, puts those words in front of not just this Parliament, but the people of Scotland, that over 10,000 children are living, enduring life in temporary accommodation, forced, as we've just heard, to live upwards of a year in such conditions, with mould-infested rooms, beds soaked with urine, shared spacing with vermin, just some of the harrowing conditions that are reported. And this is not just an issue of poor housing, it is a fundamental breach of human rights. And it actively harms these children's physical and mental health, their development, their education, their life chances. Deputy Presiding Officer, it is not just a housing crisis, but a moral failure. And we are a country that prides itself on our values of fairness and of human rights. And yet children here are growing up isolated from their peers, placed far from their schools, subjected to environments filled with fear and anxiety. They're not just bad conditions, they violate the rights outlined in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which this Parliament enshrined into law. Article 27 states that parties, governments, recognise the right of every child to a standard of living adequate for the child's physical, mental, spiritual, moral and social development. This article makes it clear, unequivocally, the responsibility of the Scottish Government under the UNCRC Incorporation Scotland Act to ensure that these rights on adequate standards of living are upheld. And as Willie Rennie has pointed out, in the amendment adding on to the motion today, I welcome the fact that the Scottish Government accept their responsibility and indeed the breach of the UNCRC rights. Because children have a right to live in safe, stable, secure environments. They have a right to attend school without fear of being displaced or living in unhealthy conditions. They should not have to suffer the trauma of inadequate housing that impacts on their health, their education and their well-being. And the Scottish Government has a responsibility to uphold those rights. And the failure to do so is not just a policy failure. It is a failure to meet the moral and the legal obligations to protect children here. The consequences of the breach of children's rights are profound. Children suffer from sleep deprivation, poor nutrition, respiratory illness, mental health challenges. They fall behind in their education, struggle to maintain friendships, live in fear for their future. They're not just effects of poor housing. They are a direct result of the failure to prioritise children's rights in policy and in practice. On top of this, the Promise Oversight Board remind us in their recent report, children in families in temporary accommodation are more likely to be taken into care. When we fail on housing, we fail on so much. The right to a home is fundamental to the promise being kept. Deputy Presiding Officer, Scotland's children deserve more than just words. They deserve a government that takes action to address the crisis, ensure that every child has access to safe, stable, supportive home environment. And I welcome that the Minister is closing, because I wonder if he will recall in 2012, when the Housing Minister was leader of East Lothian Council, he said, "We are proud of what we have achieved, but we recognise that we're only as good as our last achievement." So I'd ask the Minister, what was the last achievement he was proud of regarding children in temporary accommodation?
Thank you. We now come to the final speaker in the open debate, Willie Coffey, up to 4 minutes. Mr Coffey.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. The Shelter report provides us with some pretty clear messaging around the impact on children and young people who are experiencing life in temporary accommodation. The focus of the report on safety, health and educational development has been incredibly helpful. Some of the testimonials were positive, but mostly they were not, and they were hard to read. The first thing that occurred to me was to ask why temporary accommodation generally always seems to be in such poor condition. Why is it that homeless families and kids are given housing, even temporary housing, that isn't fit for purpose? There's really no excuse for that. It's as if they don't matter, that somehow homeless families can take second best when it comes to being rehoused. Surely that has to stop. One of the areas in the report that also caught my eye was a section on mould and damp specifically. This seemed to be prevalent in the temporary housing featured in the study, and the comments from a wee 6-year-old child were pretty awful, describing his or her bed as being soaking wet due to the dampness in the house. Presiding Officer, it's beyond me as to why a house in that condition can be used at all. And I ask the Government and the Councils to take a serious look at preventing the use of accommodation that isn't fit to be lived in. Now, sadly, councils have done that for years. Labour and Tory councils too, let's remember. The impacts of this issue went beyond the discomfort of the dampness itself. It had wider implications for the children who expressed fear and anxiety to the researchers about the conditions that they were living in. And add to that the frustration and anger of parents who were trying to solve those issues on top of the homelessness situation they were already facing. It presented a disturbing picture for us all. I think back, Presiding Officer, to my own early days as a local councillor in the 1990s, when a big proportion of my inquiries came from tenants living in damp houses with mould. We've come a long way since then, and I know now that 90% of all housing stock, according to the current Scottish Housing Conditions Survey, is free from this stuff. But it's still there and causing misery, and it's causing harm in equal measure. Only yesterday at our Housing Committee, we heard of testimonials from people suffering dampness in their home, not temporary accommodation, and the problems encountered in trying to deal with it. We know it can be complex to sort it, and the committee evidence also talked about improving the specialist skills that we need to diagnose and treat these problems. But even now, Presiding Officer, 30-odd years later, we've still got examples of fungicidal washing and paint being used as the sole means to keep it at bay, but it doesn't solve the problem. My question for our councils is, why are you continuing to allocate houses that are clearly damp and mouldy at the outset? And that includes some of this temporary housing that features in the report. Surely we should outlaw that practice too, on top of AWAB's law if we indeed embrace that. I'm indebted, as ever, Presiding Officer, to my East Ayrshire colleagues who advised me that the number of kids living in temporary accommodation down there is dropping year on year and is currently around 25. It's too many, yes, but it's amongst the lowest in Scotland. They are doing their best. They're building more council houses than ever before. They're also buying back substantial numbers of properties too. And all of this work taken together shows that the council there is doing all it can to tackle the problems of demand and capacity. The big investment of £768 million for affordable homes will help this problem significantly, and they hope to build over 600 new affordable homes in the period ahead. But finally, my main focus of the comments, I think, are rightly what's in this shelter report, Presiding Officer. And I'm assured by the Minister's comments at the outset that the Government accepts these recommendations and will act on the findings to address the issues that are presented to us there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Coffey. We now move to the closing speeches, and I call first Maggie Chapman. Up to 4 minutes, Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In closing this debate for the Scottish Greens, I reiterate my thanks to Shelter, to the researchers, to the children and families who have made this report such a valuable, such a challenging and such a human testament. It not only shows us what is wrong, it shows us the paths to making it right, to making the rights of children real. There are immediate provisions to be made, support and services, access to amenities and facilities, and to better, much better temporary accommodation while that is still needed. There are policies to be changed, standards for temporary accommodation set at the same level as those for permanent housing, inclusion of primary health services in prevention strategies, prioritisation of families with children and those children most in need. And there is a wider picture too, and a desperately urgent one. We call once more upon the Scottish Government to build more high-quality permanent homes for social rent, including homes large enough for families. We reiterate our commitment to ending homelessness and to a housing-first approach as its central pillar. And we call upon this Parliament to show courage and commitment in making the Housing Bill an opportunity for real and transformational change. The amendments that we and others have brought forward will go some way to help that. No child should face eviction over the winter months. No woman facing domestic abuse should have to make the choice between staying in an abusive home or making herself and her children homeless. No family should have their physical and mental health jeopardised by mould and damp. I welcome opportunities to engage on these and many other issues over the coming months with the Minister and others as the Housing Bill makes its way through Parliament. But I would echo Willie Rennie's call on the Minister. Please tell us how you are going to address the recommendations in the report now, because we need action now. And we need to see compassion and justice at every level of government. Poisonous rhetoric about social security, suspicion and scorn for those who are in need, an obsession with work when parents are already working their fingers to the bone and still can't afford to eat. None of that is going to help. The workhouse mentality hasn't gone away, it seems. The idea that the very worst thing a government can do is to provide food and shelter for someone who doesn't deserve them, whatever deserve means in that context. In truth, the worst thing that a government can do in this context is to deny children the basics of a happy childhood as a way of punishing their parents. When we as a parliament, as a nation, passed the UNCRC bill, we weren't just taking on a legal responsibility, we were taking on a moral one. We in the Scottish Greens take that responsibility, that moral responsibility, very seriously. And I know that colleagues across this chamber do too. But we also need the conviction to act, because we must act, and we must act now, for all of our children's sake. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Jeremy Balfour. Again, around 4 minutes. Mr Balfour.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think the Shelter report can be summed up in one sentence. The SNP have failed Scottish children. Our country is gripped by a housing crisis, which is forcing thousands of vulnerable people out of their homes and into a system that is unable to handle their workload. As already been mentioned this afternoon, there are over 33,619 households who are assessed as homeless in 23-24, including 15,000 children. Take a moment to think about that. 15,000 children without a safe place to call home. And in the last 15 minutes of this debate, we have heard not one practical solution from this government or from its members on how this is going to change. This number should shame all 129 of us, but it should shame the Scottish Government even more. And in my region here of Lothian, the picture is bleak as it is on a national level. We have 3,600 children in temporary accommodation in Edinburgh in 23-24. The figure, as Mr Simpson pointed out, is larger than the whole children in temporary accommodation of Wales during the same time. Deputy Presiding Officer, this government must stop talking and start acting to protect the most vulnerable in our society. For too many years, we have continued to oversee a worsening situation. Make no mistake, what we see in Scotland today is a modern-day scandal. Deputy Presiding Officer, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child states that every child has a right to a standard of living adequate for their physical, mental, spiritual, moral and social development. And as Mr Rennie pointed out in his speech, the government haven't sought to amend the Labour motion before us this afternoon. They are happy to accept that they are in breach of this, not just once, but over and over again. Not only the number of children in temporary accommodation unacceptable, but the conditions that we've heard from other speakers is unacceptable. Mould, damp, heating systems that don't work during the winter months. This is unacceptable. We have a housing bill, which we will debate tomorrow in committee, which I think, even at this point, will have almost no effect to bring benefit to these children. The government has refused to look at amendments that would look to improve this bill. We want to disencourage people from renting accommodation, and we will see less property being put up for rent in the next years because of what is in the bill. And even worse than that, the only way to actually solve this solution is to build more houses. And yet, what have we seen under the Scottish Government administration? A fall in house building in Scotland. Unsuitable accommodation, lack of house building, and not a willingness to listen to experts to change this bill. This government should go away and think again, not for my sake, but for the sake of the children here in Lothian and across Scotland. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Balfour. I now call on the Minister. Around 5 minutes, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The report published earlier this month highlighted the devastating impact living in poor quality temporary accommodation can have on children's lives. And we've all heard of examples of that today. And I take that as one of my main objectives as Housing Minister. In response to the research findings, Shelter Scotland stated, there is a duty on us all to act on what we've heard. So, Presiding Officer, this government is already acting. I talked around about the £768 million investment, the acquisitions and voids funding, which has seen reductions in Edinburgh, which I think Faisal Choudhury also mentioned as well, but another 4 areas under the most sustained pressure. But we all need to act on this together. One of the key things I think was in the crisis report was the UK government also needs to act on the local housing allowance and in tackling poverty. The local housing allowance, again, has been frozen. And in that crisis report, they mentioned that it is the biggest influence on pushing people into homelessness. So we need the Labour government to act upon that. And again, I'll ask colleagues from the Labour Party to engage with that. The Tories had that policy for a number of years and knew the impact of that as well. So they've got to take responsibility on that particular point. That report also mentioned that the policy on local housing allowance pushed people into homelessness. And that's something that the Tories have to acknowledge in terms of that as well. So our ambition, everybody's ambition in here, is for every household to have a settled home, and we are firmly committed to reducing the number of households, especially with those in temporary accommodation. And I'll touch on the point that Mr Rennie talked about. I've talked about the voids and acquisitions, and one of the things we've done in engaging with the Housing to 2040 group is looking and working with local authorities on targeting homes that need to be purchased for kids, for families with large numbers of children. So again, that's a targeted focus, and we're starting to see that with 20 local authorities, through the Chair, in terms of reduction in temporary accommodation. So, and that's key, I think, in terms of that. I think I talked about the £200 million. That's obviously increasing housing supply. I'll come on to the point about investment in a little second that Megan Gallagher talked about in terms of that. Now, obviously, we are all quite rightly concerned here of the experiences that children described in research are living in conditions that breach the unsuitable accommodation order. Of course we do. Everybody does. The action the Scottish Government taken is now is intended to move us out of the housing emergency, but they know that this will take time and requires a sustained and joint effort from all parties. And again, I'll come and touch on that in a little second. Local authorities, and that was mentioned, of all colours are responsible for that as well. And they're all working extremely hard to increase the supply of social, affordable housing and deliver services for people experiencing homelessness. We have been and will continue to work in partnership with local government. And we won't be supporting the Tory amendment today for the very reason is we've been working very closely with local authorities in their own housing emergency action plans. So we think it's better to work with local authorities on their own local housing emergency rather than the national picture. We've seen the effect of that where we're getting reductions in Edinburgh, for example, about 40%. So we're working with them in terms of their own local housing emergency action plans. I've got time.
Mark Griffin.
I have to ask the Minister, what is the point in declaring a national housing emergency if the government aren't going to take national responsibility? We'd be as well just leaving 32 councils to get on with it and not bothered with declaring a national housing emergency here in this Parliament.
Minister, and give you the time
quite
back.
happy to answer that particular point. I think this is in consultation with the local authorities as well. If you look at Edinburgh, you look at Glasgow, you look at other local authorities, their situations are all different. So in terms of what we're doing, we've targeted in terms of increasing the budget to £768 million, the increase in voids and acquisition funding, again, is an important part of that. The Empty Homes Partnership, we talked around about the £4 million pilot. So we think it's better to work in engagement with the local authorities on their own specifics. And that's demonstrated in the action we're taking and seeing the reductions, where we've seen 20 local authorities have a reduction in temporary accommodations for children. So I think that's an important point. Reducing the number of households and time spent in temporary accommodations is, of course, a priority for this government, as it is for everybody else. Housing is also critical to delivery of our national mission to eradicate child poverty. And I think Marie McNair made the point around about the announcement yesterday from the UK Government on disability benefits. That's not going to help the housing situation at all. That's going to push more people, more families with children into homelessness. The Scottish Government also spends more money per person in the UK Government on discretionary housing payments. And again, this is where the UK Labour Government can help in this. We spend £97 million in 25-26, and that's an increase in 24-25. again, if UK Government can help us, this would help us in trying to reduce the figures that we're talking about. I want to talk on some of the amendments, and I know tomorrow we've got the discussion around about UN. Again, I'll take, yeah.
Megan Gallagher, briefly.
Is the Minister going to accept any responsibility for the actions of his government that has led to a housing emergency and also the issues of temporary accommodation with children?
Minister, and give you the time back.
Into that point. In terms of the amendments we're talking about, I said we'd be engaging. I said I would come back, and I'm going to come back to the points that was made by Megan Gallagher on after the point I make with Mark Griffin. So I think in terms of that, we discussed about UNCRC. We will be voting yes on the Labour proposal today. In terms of that, we're also trying to acknowledge in terms of the progress that has been made. So again, coming on to the points about Megan Gallagher. She made a few points around about the task and finish groups. They did feed in directly into the housing bill. In terms of investment, she knows as well as Graham Simpson does that I really value the impact of BTR and MMR and other investment opportunities. Just this afternoon, we met with the Housing Investment Task Force who have produced recommendations. Government will be looking at these and come back to the group very quickly on terms of that, acknowledging the value of that particular area. And again, they fed into the rent controls discussion. So, and I said we'll come back to that particular point. Willie Rennie made the point, and I think in terms of looking at the opportunities in terms of the investment sector. So we've talked again about, and Mr Rennie and I have talked about that again in terms of the value about bringing investment into Scotland. And we need that. It's not just government funding, it's funding from other areas as well. The point he mentioned and our issues in asylum, we are discussing that with the UK Government. There are pressures, as he's mentioned, specifically around about Glasgow, but we're discussing with the UK Government on that particular point. So I think in terms of looking at the actions we've taken and the point you've taken out, of course we take responsibility for that, and that's why we've looked at £768 million. That's why we've looked at the Temporary Accommodation Fund and £4 million in terms of that as well. We will be engaging with Shelter on this particular point as well. So of course we take a responsibility for it. That's why we've brought the actions forward that we've decided to do. On the point that Graham Simpson made, the reason that the Cabinet Secretary isn't here is it's a long-standing meeting with the UK Government, just to put that on record. And I think Willie Coffey also mentioned a point about parties of all colours being involved in this. That's all local authorities that are involved in that. So I think we touched on about the amending the housing bill to require social landlords to investigate and address issues that, if left unintended, could cause health problems. In the worst case, obviously, of AWAB Ishak. Now, that provides social rent tenants with assurances that homes will be of good quality, and we're engaging with the private rented sector on that particular point. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, we know that Scotland has strong homelessness rights that mean households have the safety net of temporary accommodation when needed as a legal right. We are taking action, and we're seeing these actions coming through. The number of children in temporary accommodation dropping by in 20 local authorities, and also the number of voids and acquisitions also falling. We've also implemented a wide range of anti-poverty measures, including the Scottish Child Payment, mitigating the bedroom tax benefit cap to address issues we know to contribute to a household presenting as homeless, negating the need for them to enter into temporary accommodation. On the point around about the UNCRC, again, I said I would be discussing that. In conclusion, Minister? Yep, with Mr Griffin on that point, and happy to meet with Mr Whitfield on that point also. The Housing Scotland Bill will strengthen protections for households from potential harm that could be caused from living in social rented properties. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call on Pam Duncan-Glancy to wind up the debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's a privilege to close today's debate on behalf of the Scottish Labour Party, and I'd like to start where Maggie Chapman and others have, which is to thank Shelter Scotland for all their work on this. Today, as we discuss this issue, 15,000 children are homeless, as Jeremy Balfour reminded us, and 10,360 children are living in temporary accommodation across Scotland. My colleague Mark Griffin and others have set out at the very start of this debate the dark reality of this for children and those closest to them every day. We've heard across the chamber about the intolerable conditions children find themselves in. And as many have said, we've also been devastated by the tragedy of the death of Awab Ishak. And I'm pleased to hear members from across the chamber, including Megan Gallagher, the Minister, and others, support the need to act and bring in Awab's law. I hope that members will support the amendments to the housing bill on this in Mark Griffin's name. And I agree with Willie Rennie that the Government could inject urgency on this, and supporting those amendments could indicate that. The number of people in temporary accommodation placements that have been in breach of the unsuitable accommodation order reached 7,423.24. This is an increase of 41%, or 2,160 on the previous year. And, Presiding Officer, Shelter Scotland's recent report on children's experience in temporary accommodation, a painful reminder, as Faisal Chowdhury rightly called it, a damning report, as Graham Simpson correctly stated, sets out the intolerable real-life consequences of these alarming statistics for some of the most marginalised and disadvantaged children in our society, and many members shared concern and mentioned these today. The UNCRC sets out what children across Scotland, should expect, and that the UN have commented on how bad things are must really be a wake-up call, as Willie Rennie has said, and I agree with Martin Whitfield when he says this represents a failure. The UNCRC provides children with rights to have their best interests considered when decisions about them are being taken, including the right to life and the ability to develop, the right to school, the right to protection from violence in all forms, and the right to play and rest. It's a huge concern that the Shelter report highlights that these rights are being breached. One such right, of course, has had attention from members across the chamber today. Article 28, that every child has the right to an education. And given its wide-ranging impact, it's no surprise that so many members have spoken about this today. The instability and uncertainty that comes with living in temporary accommodation has significant impacts on a child's education and development, and ultimately their life chances. Every day that a child spends in temporary accommodation is a day too long, and a day that holds back their education and their opportunities. Shelter Scotland's report, of course, lays bare the impact of this. The sheer logistics of children and their parents that they face when their housing is not near the school, meaning long commutes, and associated financial burdens, lateness and increased stress. The disruption to school attendance, social connections and emotional sustainability that Willie Coffey spoke passionately of, that comes with frequent relocation, which sees many children with trouble adjusting to new schools and losing access to friends, networks, preferred resources or activities. With pupil absence rates stubbornly high for many, the Government must also consider the exacerbation of this for children living in temporary accommodation, because the quality of temporary accommodation has been highlighted as a significant factor in young people and children's distress, both at home and in school. And the Shelter Scotland report concluded that noise and inadequate sleep in temporary accommodation negatively impacts on children's academic performance and concentration. The instability, the report found, also affected teenagers' eligibility for EMA, further exacerbating concerns. Presiding Officer, there is much evidence on the link between poor housing and negative educational experiences, which is why it's not just the case that we should move children living in temporary accommodation into secure housing to improve their life chances today, but because for every one of the 10,000 children in Scotland in temporary accommodation, we hold them back today and in the future. This is an issue that is keenly felt by my constituents in the Glasgow region too. A recent letter from the Glasgow City Council to Local Government, Housing and Planning Committee revealed that as of February this year, 3,503 children were living in temporary accommodation in Glasgow. That's more than all the children stuck in temporary accommodation across the whole of Wales in December. The City of Glasgow alone has more children in temporary accommodation than the whole of Wales. Let that sink in. Ultimately, children in the region I represent, as well as across Scotland, are being failed. There is no excuse and no explanation for the number of children that are in temporary accommodation. And whilst I'm pleased that most members engaged with the seriousness of this issue, I have to say I'm a little disappointed that some members chose to list actions, or lack thereof of the Government, actions that have so far failed, instead of setting out how the member could work to get serious about addressing the housing crisis of the Government's making. We must move quickly to move children to secure, safe and affordable homes. The use of hotel-like accommodation for children in temporary accommodation carries a huge risk of breaching children's rights under the UNCRC, but it is also a failure of our moral duty to children across Scotland. And I note there are amendments to the Housing Bill on the UNCRC that would require relevant bodies to have regard to the rights of the child in dealing with cases of homelessness. And I hope the Minister will support them tomorrow. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, Scottish Labour want everyone to live in a warm, safe, accessible and affordable home. That means driving up the supply of housing across all tenures and ensuring that children in Scotland are placed in safe, secure homes which take account of their rights, including under the UNCRC. And I hope that Parliament will support our calls to do that today. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr